Her son called her the old tenant who won't move out in front of his guests. Maggie, librarian and 40% owner of the house, stood unshaken. Chloe, his polished wife, smiled like the joke was hers. By Monday, Maggie's name would be the only one that mattered on the renovation permits. She'd spent years as their downstairs neighbor. Now she was the gatekeeper of their future. And when they tried to tear down her walls, the deed in her desk drawer would hold them up. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The peach cobbler was still warm when Maggie eased open the wrought iron gate, the hinges sighing the way old ones do. Savannah's air wrapped around her, humid, perfumed faintly with magnolia from the courtyard tree. Overhead, string lights looped from balcony to balcony, their glow pooling on the brick like small islands of gold. From the open front door came the muffled sound of laughter and clinking glasses. She shifted the covered Pyrex against her hip, squared her shoulders, and stepped into the upper floor world her son now called home. Daniel appeared in the doorway with a wine glass in hand, crisp shirt sleeves rolled to just the right point on his forearms. His smile was wide, but it was the kind he wore for rooms, not for people. "Everyone," he said, lifting his glass slightly, "this is my mom, our old tenant who won't move out." It landed in the air like a pebble dropped in a still pond. A few guests chuckled politely, others laughed outright. Maggie felt the sound pass through her like a cool draft. Her jaw flexed once, then settled. From somewhere behind Daniel, Chloe's voice chimed in, smooth as silk ribbon. "She's harmless," she told a woman in coral silk, a hand resting lightly on the guest's arm. Maggie offered her own thin smile, the one she used to give library patrons who called overdue fines a silly rule. "Peach cobbler," she said, holding the dish up just enough to break the moment. "Still warm. We should find it a place to rest." Daniel stepped aside. "Kitchen's this way." She followed him through the living room, taking in the space, gleaming hardwood, polished brass fixtures, and Chloe's curated touches. Neutral throws, a wall of wedding photos, succulents lined up like obedient children on the sill. People parted to let her pass, each nodding politely, as if she'd been invited to serve hors d'oeuvres rather than share a roof. In the kitchen, a marble island displayed a neat spread of cheese, figs, and crackers on monogrammed napkins, D and C in embossed gold. Maggie set the cobbler down, removed the napkin covering it, and let the steam curl into the air. The smell of peaches, brown sugar, and cinnamon slipped between the more modern scents of citrus perfume and sharp wine. "It's lovely," Chloe said, appearing at Maggie's side with a champagne flute in hand. Her tone was practiced, her smile even more so. "You really didn't have to." "I wanted to," Maggie replied. "It's a housewarming." "Technically, a condo warming," Daniel corrected with a half laugh before realizing too late how it sounded. "I suppose it depends which part of the house you're talking about," Maggie said lightly, eyes resting on the staircase that connected the floors. The original oak banister caught the light, showing its years in every groove. Chloe followed her gaze. "We've been telling everyone about the renovations. We're planning to open up that whole stairwell, make it one big, airy space." Maggie let her fingertips rest on the edge of the counter. "Airy's nice, so's having bones that hold a place together." Chloe's laugh was too quick. "Oh, the contractor will figure all that out." Daniel cleared his throat and motioned her toward the living room. "Come on, Mom. Let's mingle." She did, but not without letting her eyes wander. To the strangers in seersucker talking about property values, to Chloe's mother preening by the balcony doors, to the stack of glossy brochures half hidden beneath a cutting board on the side counter. The corner of one sheet showed a floor plan with a bold arrow marked "Remove." Maggie's hand twitched the way it did when she saw a misfiled book spine. She fixed her smile, let her gaze sweep the room, and stepped back into the hum of voices, filed away what she'd just seen and exactly where she'd seen it. Across the room, a familiar face from the neighborhood association lifted a glass in her direction. He was standing beside a man she knew from the city's permitting office. Both were looking toward the stairs, and for the first time that night, Maggie felt the flicker of an idea worth keeping. Maggie let herself out through the courtyard gate just after 9, the cobbler dish rinsed and wrapped in foil under her arm. The music upstairs had shifted to something louder, the bass line pushing faint tremors through the old brick. Her key slid into the downstairs lock, and she stepped into the cooler air of her own domain. The difference between the two floors was immediate. Up there, curated polish. Down here, the quiet weight of bookshelves, mismatched but solid furniture, and the faint scent of lemon oil from the afternoon's dusting. She set the empty dish in the sink and, without taking off her shoes, crossed to the secretary desk by the front window. The deed folder was where it had always been, middle drawer to the left of the blue fountain pen she favored for serious notes. She pulled it out and laid it flat, smoothing the creases from the manila cover as if opening an atlas. "Pour you a glass?" Ivy's voice came from the doorway. She slipped in with the easy familiarity of someone who'd been coming through that door for 20 years, a bottle of Pinot Grigio dangling from one hand. Her silver hair caught the lamplight, her sandals clicking softly on the wood. "Please," Maggie said, eyes scanning the dense print of the property agreement. Ivy poured and set the glass beside her. "There," Ivy said, leaning over and tapping a paragraph halfway down the page with a crimson nail. "Right there. 40% ownership, and—" She flipped the page, the paper whispering, "Joint consent required for all structural alterations." Maggie read it twice, the words settling like heavy coins in her palm. Ivy's smile was thin but wicked. "They've forgotten." Before Maggie could answer, the phone on the desk trilled, a deep, old-fashioned bell. She picked it up. "Rob Finch," came the calm voice on the line, "just confirming you're aware that your agreement gives you veto power over any changes to the building's structure." "I'm aware," Maggie said, glancing toward Ivy, who raised her glass in silent toast. "Then you also know," Rob continued, "that any contractor's permit has to carry your signature alongside theirs. No exceptions." "I know now." "Good," Rob said, and she could hear papers being stacked on his end. Always nice when people remember who actually owns the bones. When she hung up, Ivy had moved to the couch, one leg tucked under her. "You going to tell them?" "Not tonight." Maggie slid the folder closed, aligning the edges with deliberate care. "Some things you keep where they belong until you need them." She rose and crossed to the small writing desk tucked beside the bookshelf. A fresh legal pad waited there, pale yellow under the lamp's glow. She uncapped her pen and wrote, in a neat librarian's script, the first line, "Housewarming, old tenant who won't move out." From the ceiling above, the bass thumped again, followed by the tinny crash of laughter. Chloe's voice carrying in a pitch Maggie now recognized as her hostess tone. She kept writing, harmless. "Contractor will figure it out." Airtight banister comment ignored. Ivy watched from the couch, her expression unreadable. "What are you doing?" "Taking inventory," Maggie said. The list grew, snippets of overheard conversation, the way Daniel's eyes slid past hers when she entered the kitchen, the smirk from the man in seersucker when Chloe had mentioned eventually moving her out. Every detail in its place, no cross-outs. By the time she set the pen down, the page was half filled. She folded it once, slid it into the deed folder, and locked the drawer. Above them, the footsteps moved toward the balcony, the laughter spilling with them. The muffled hum of conversation grew sharper when someone opened the French doors. A woman's voice floated down, Chloe's again, talking about a fresh start once the space is really ours. Maggie tipped her head toward the sound, her eyes narrowing just enough for Ivy to notice. "What?" Ivy asked softly. "Nothing," Maggie said and reached for her wine. "Not yet." Upstairs, the music changed again, brighter, faster, and Maggie felt the vibration through the soles of her shoes. She let the stem of her glass rest against her lip for a moment before setting it down. She knew now exactly where her leverage lived, and she knew, just as clearly, that they didn't have a clue. By Monday morning, Maggie had a plan. It arrived the way some books did, unrequested but inevitable, falling into her hands with a weight that felt right. She sat at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee, the steam curling in lazy ribbons, and flipped open her notebook to a clean page. At the top, in tidy script, she wrote, Friends and neighbors gathering, Saturday. Below it, she began listing names, starting with the people who had once lived in the duplex, moving on to the shop owners who kept an eye on her stoop, and then to the handful of upstairs guests whose polite smiles at the housewarming had been genuine. It wasn't hard to fill the page. By 10, she was on the phone with Tasha Reynolds. "You want it Southern or Savannah Southern?" Tasha asked, her voice warm with curiosity and the faint clatter of pans in the background. "Savannah Southern," Maggie said. "Smoked brisket, shrimp, and grits, the kind of grits that ruin all other grits." Tasha laughed. "Local beer or wine?" "Both," Maggie said. "We'll let them choose their own mistakes." By noon, Ivy was perched at the dining room table, a stack of cream cardstock between them. She had already chosen a font, something with just enough flourish to feel deliberate but not fussy, and was sliding each finished invitation into its envelope with the precision of a card dealer. "Deliver by hand to the folks in walking distance," Ivy said, licking the flap. "Mail the rest and, include upstairs. It'll look gracious." "Of course," Maggie said, reaching for the next envelope. "Wouldn't want anyone to feel left out." The rest of the week moved like a quiet current. Thursday, a delivery truck backed into the courtyard, men in blue shirts unloading folding tables and stacks of mismatched wooden chairs Maggie had rented from a church. The air smelled of sawdust and heat as they carried the furniture across the brick. Maggie stood in the shade, directing them toward the wider end of the courtyard where the light would be soft by evening. She was halfway through explaining the placement when she caught movement at the upstairs balcony. Chloe leaned on the railing, hair perfectly smooth despite the humidity, eyes narrowed against the sun. Her gaze slid from the chairs to the tables, then to Maggie, and back again. No words, just the faint arch of one brow before she stepped back inside. Friday evening, Maggie and Ivy strung warm white lights between the courtyard trees, winding them along the wrought iron fence until the place glowed like a pageant. The air was thick with honeysuckle and the faint promise of rain that never came. As they worked, a shadow appeared at the gate. Daniel stepped in, hands shoved into his pockets, his tie loosened from the day. "So, big weekend?" he said, glancing at the tables, the lights, the covered serving station Tasha's crew had dropped off that afternoon. "Just a gathering," Maggie said, adjusting a strand so it draped evenly. He nodded slowly, the way you do when you're trying to mask a question you don't want to ask. "At least, keep it small?" His tone was halfway between a request and a warning. Maggie looked at him then, really looked, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the tension riding in his shoulders. "I'll keep it exactly the size it needs to be," she said. He opened his mouth, thought better of it, and closed it again. "Right," he muttered, backing toward the gate. "Well, have fun." When he was gone, Ivy tightened the last twist tie on the lights and stepped back to admire their work. "It's going to be beautiful," she said. "It's going to be remembered," Maggie corrected. Somewhere above them, a window slid open. Footsteps crossed the upstairs living room, and then Chloe's voice drifted into the warm night, low but clear enough for Maggie to catch. "Daniel, she's doing this on purpose." Maggie allowed herself the smallest of smiles and reached up to switch on the lights. The courtyard bloomed with gold. By late Saturday afternoon, the courtyard was unrecognizable. The mismatched chairs were dressed with cushions Ivy had dug out of her linen closet, the tables draped in clean white cloths that caught the sunlight like sails. Overhead, the string lights waited to glow, their bulbs dull in the daylight. Tasha's crew had been there since noon, coaxing smoke from the brisket in a barrel smoker that sent mouth-watering ribbons into the air, curling over the wrought iron fence. The scent drew curious glances from passers-by on Whitaker Street, a few of whom slowed until Ivy waved them in like a carnival barker. By 5, the place was humming. Neighbors clustered in easy circles, beer bottles sweating in their hands, plates loaded with shrimp and grits rich enough to make conversation pause mid-sentence. Music drifted from a speaker tucked near the magnolia tree, old Otis Redding, a nod to the locals who knew. Maggie moved through it all in a soft linen dress, her hair pinned loosely at the nape. She didn't need to work the room came to her. A man in his 60s, cardigan despite the heat, laughed until he wiped his eyes. "Do you remember, Maggie, when Danny here—" He jabbed a fork toward Daniel, who had just wandered into earshot. "Got his head stuck between the balusters? We had to butter his ears to get him out." There was a ripple of laughter, genuine and unforced. Daniel's smile was tight, but he nodded. "Yeah, that was something." "Something," the man repeated, chuckling again. "Boy was wailing like a banshee." Ivy appeared at Maggie's elbow, a glass of sweet tea in one hand. She was making her way from group to group, introducing old friends to new acquaintances with the precision of a matchmaker. "Do you know Margaret's friend Nora? Owns the flower shop on Broughton?" she asked a young couple in tailored casuals. "She did the arrangements for the mayor's fundraiser last spring." Across the courtyard, Tasha sliced into the brisket, the pink smoke ring glistening under the blade. The aroma seemed to thicken the air, pulling in people who had no business being there, dog walkers, tourists, even a jogger who stopped mid-stride to investigate. Ivy welcomed them all with a nod and a plate. Chloe appeared at the far end of the courtyard, framed in the open gate. She wore a sundress the color of champagne and carried herself like a hostess who'd lost her guest list. Her eyes swept the crowd, pausing on every unfamiliar face. She smiled, small, tight, but it didn't reach her eyes. When Maggie caught her gaze, Chloe tipped her chin in a greeting that was almost convincing, then drifted along the fence line, speaking to no one. Her attention flicked to the food table, to the strangers laughing with plates in hand, and back to Maggie again. Daniel came up beside his mother, his voice pitched for her alone. "You're stealing our spotlight." Maggie didn't look at him right away. She watched Ivy laughing with two men from the neighborhood association, watched Chloe pause near the magnolia as if the shade might cool her temper. Then she turned, her expression neutral. "Spotlights are funny things," she said. "They tend to follow the action." He stared at her for a moment, searching for something in her face, but she gave him nothing. The music shifted to something with a little more swing, and the crowd seemed to swell with it. Someone started clapping along, and a child, whose parents Maggie couldn't place, ran between the tables, giggling, a balloon trailing behind on a string. Maggie let the hum of the party wash over her, the scent of brisket and buttered grits, the warm clink of glasses, the murmur of 100 small conversations. This was her space tonight, every inch of it alive in a way it hadn't been in years. From the balcony above, a figure leaned forward into the light. It was Chloe, now with a phone in her hand, her thumb working quickly. She wasn't watching the party anymore, she was photographing it. And by the set of her jaw, Maggie knew those pictures weren't meant for the scrapbook. The sun had dipped low enough for the courtyard to feel wrapped in amber. String lights glowed overhead, their reflection glinting off glasses and the brass serving tongs Tasha wielded like a general. Somewhere near the magnolia, a cluster of voices harmonized with Otis, low and imperfect but full of joy. Maggie was standing near the center table talking to the former postmaster's wife when Ivy touched her elbow. "You should say a few words," she murmured, eyes glinting. "It's your party, after all." Maggie looked around. Plates were still heavy with food, drinks were topped off, and conversations were rich with the kind of ease that doesn't happen in the presence of a strained host. She nodded. "Friends?" she called, her voice clear without needing to be loud. Conversations trickled to a stop, faces turning toward her. The music dimmed to a background hum. "I just wanted to thank you all for coming to my home tonight," she said, letting the word "my" find its place. A small, warm smile settled on her lips, the kind that invited no argument. "I've been lucky," she continued, "to live in this beautiful building, in this beautiful city, and to share it with people who care about it as much as I do. Some of you already know, others may not, that I'm not just a tenant here, I'm also an owner. Part of this building is mine, in every legal sense." There was a ripple, subtle like wind-shifting leaves. Ivy, already moving through the nearest cluster of guests, added her own garnish. 40% to be exact, and she gets a say in anything that happens to it. She said it as if she were telling someone about a prize-winning garden, her tone cheerful but loaded enough to make Daniel stiffen where he stood. Maggie caught the flicker in a few faces. understanding sliding into place, eyes darting upstairs toward the darkened balcony where Chloe had vanished. She went on, her voice even. When you own part of a place, you take care of it. You preserve the history, you welcome neighbors, you keep its doors open for the right kind of company. Someone chuckled softly, not unkindly. Another guest murmured something to the man beside her, both of them now glancing at Daniel. "I'm proud," Maggie said, lifting her glass, "to have this chance to show you what hospitality means to me, because if it doesn't start at home, where does it start?" She let the question hang for a beat, then added, "To hospitality that starts at home." Glasses lifted, the chorus of cheers ringing out under the magnolia branches. Ivy clinked her glass against Maggie's with a grin that said perfectly done. Across from them, Daniel raised his beer bottle slowly, his jaw tight. When his eyes met Maggie's over the rim, there was no smile, just the thinnest thread of tension pulling his expression taut. She sipped, unhurried. Around them, conversations began again, though now there was a subtle undercurrent, quiet exchanges, half-hidden glances toward the upstairs windows. The courtyard felt warmer, closer, charged with the knowledge she'd just put into the air. From the shadowed gate, Chloe reappeared, phone in hand, expression neutral, but eyes sharp. She scanned the crowd, saw the small knots of people speaking low, and then looked directly at Maggie. The two women regarded each other for the length of a heartbeat. No smiles, no nods. Daniel set his drink down harder than necessary on the nearest table. The bottle wobbled before righting itself, and somewhere deep in Maggie's chest, that earlier flicker of an idea stretched into something with weight, heat, and a timeline. The last of the toast's echo was still hanging in the warm air when Maggie felt the shift, like the breeze had changed direction. She'd just set her glass on the corner of a table when Chloe's hand appeared, light but firm, on her forearm. "Walk with me," Chloe said, her voice pleasant enough for nearby ears. They slipped toward the narrow side path between the magnolia and the back gate, string lights fading to shadows overhead. Out of sight of most guests, Chloe's smile thinned to nothing. "Why?" she asked, each word clipped. "Would you stop us?" Maggie tilted her head slightly, as though puzzling over the question. "Stop you from what?" "You know exactly what," Chloe said, crossing her arms. "The renovation, the stairwell, the plans we've been working on for months." Maggie let the pause sit. She could hear the hum of conversation from the courtyard, Ivy's laugh rising like punctuation. "Because," she said at last, "you forgot to ask the owner." Chloe's brows flicked together. "Daniel owns this unit. And I own 40% of the building," Maggie said, her tone even as a closed book. "Which means no walls come down without my consent." Before Chloe could respond, the back gate clicked open and Rob Finch stepped in, looking more like a Sunday church elder than the legal thorn he could be. "Evening," he said, nodding to them both. "Just passing through, but since I've got you here." He glanced at Chloe. "No permit gets approved without Maggie's signature. City's clear on that." Chloe's jaw worked, but she didn't speak. Rob tipped his head politely, then ambled toward the brisket line, shaking hands as if he'd been invited. From the courtyard, Ivy's voice rang out, bright and strategic. "Dessert's ready!" Peach cobbler, still warm. The crowd began to drift toward her, Tasha already at the dessert table, spoon in hand. Chloe stayed rooted for a moment, then inhaled sharply through her nose and walked back into the light, her expression rebuilt into something passably social. Maggie followed at her own pace. She collected empty glasses from a cluster near the gate, stacked them neatly, and set them beside the drinks table. A guest in seersucker offered to help, but she waved him off with a pleasant, "I've got it." The lights overhead painted everything in gold. Her dress, the magnolia leaves, the white tablecloths now rumpled with the proof of a good meal. From across the courtyard, a woman from the Historical Society caught her eye. "You look like something out of Southern Living," she called. Maggie smiled at that. Small, genuine, the kind that doesn't require teeth. She moved between tables with the slow grace of someone hosting a feature spread, her hands never idle, her gaze missing nothing. By the dessert table, Ivy was keeping conversation buoyant, telling an embellished story about the time she and Maggie chased down a city councilman over a zoning error. Guests leaned in, laughing at the punchline. Chloe stood at the opposite end, plate in hand, but her cobbler remained untouched. Daniel was beside her, speaking low. Neither looked toward Maggie. She gathered a stack of dinner plates from the main table, the weight solid in her hands. As she turned toward the kitchen door, she caught a flash of movement, Chloe slipping her phone from her bag again, angling it just enough to photograph Maggie under the lights. For a moment, Maggie wondered which image Chloe thought she was capturing, the serene hostess or the obstacle. She stepped into the kitchen, the voices of her guests a soft murmur through the open door, and set the plates in the sink. Through the window above the counter, she could see the reflection of the courtyard in the glass, her own figure framed in the glow, and Chloe watching her from the shadows. And Maggie realized she didn't mind the audience. By Tuesday morning, the courtyard had returned to quiet, the tables gone, the chairs returned, the scent of smoked brisket only a ghost in the warm air. Maggie was in the basement storage room, the one tucked behind the laundry space and the old brick boiler, turning the cool metal key in the lock. She swung the door open, inhaling that faint, dry smell of concrete and dust. The shelves inside were half hers, half upstairs. Paint cans, out-of-season wreaths, boxes labeled winter clothes in Chloe's perfect handwriting. Maggie ran her hand along the top shelf, feeling the grit settle on her fingertips. On the workbench sat a small brass dish with 2 spare keys. She pocketed them, then took out the new lock she'd bought that morning from a hardware store on Bull Street, solid, weighty in her palm. One by one, she moved her own things inside. The clay pot stacked neatly, her trowel and pruning shears, the canvas bag of seed packets, the long-handled rake that had belonged to her late husband. She arranged them in plain sight, not hidden, but displayed like a claim staked. When the last box was inside, she stepped out, closed the door, and turned the new key until she heard the firm click. By mid-afternoon, Chloe's voice carried down the back stairwell. "Maggie?" Maggie was in the kitchen, rinsing her hands under the tap. She looked up to find Chloe framed in the doorway, her expression carefully balanced between disbelief and irritation. "The storage room's locked," Chloe said. "Yes," Maggie replied, drying her hands on a linen towel. "There were things of ours in there. Shelves we use, holiday decorations, paint." "I moved my things in," Maggie said mildly. "It's part of my property allotment. You'll need to make other arrangements." Chloe blinked, once, slowly. "You can't just—" "I can," Maggie interrupted, her tone still calm. "And I have." Daniel appeared at the top of the stairs, one hand on the railing. "What's going on?" "She's locked us out of our storage," Chloe said, her voice pitched up half a note. Maggie looked at him. "It isn't our storage. It's mine. You're welcome to rent a unit. There's a place on Victory Drive, climate-controlled, very secure." Chloe let out a small laugh, incredulous. "You expect us to pay for that?" "Yes," Maggie said simply. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Daniel's eyes dropped to the floorboards. "This is about boundaries," he muttered, not looking at her. "It is," Maggie agreed. "I'm setting mine." From the corner of the room, Ivy's voice floated in. She was seated at the small breakfast table, a cup of tea cradled in her hands, having arrived 10 minutes earlier through the front door like she owned the place. She smiled into her cup. "I do love a woman who understands property lines." Chloe exhaled sharply through her nose, turned on her heel, and headed back upstairs, the click of her sandals sharp against the wood. Daniel lingered a beat longer, as if considering whether to say more, then followed without a word. Maggie crossed to the table and poured herself tea from the pot Ivy had set out. "Well," Ivy said, eyes dancing over the rim of her cup, "that should rattle the Christmas ornaments." Maggie allowed herself the faintest smile before taking a sip. Through the ceiling, faint but unmistakable, came the muffled sound of Chloe's voice, quick, sharp, and aimed at Daniel. Maggie set her cup down. "They'll adjust," she said, though her tone suggested adjustment might not be painless. Ivy leaned back in her chair, clearly enjoying the thought. and somewhere above, a door slammed hard enough to rattle the light fixture. Saturday morning brought a soft, pearled light through the lace curtains, the kind Savannah saves for days worth remembering. Maggie had set the kettle on just as the first knock came, a polite triple tap on the front door. Within minutes, her living room was alive with familiar faces. Mrs. Greer from the Historical Society, 2 retired teachers from the next block, a couple of young architects eager to see authentic Victorian detailing in private homes. Ivy, wearing a linen blazer over a striped tee, stood near the entry with a clipboard like she was checking off passengers for a voyage. "All right, folks," Maggie said, smoothing her palms over her skirt. "We'll start here in the parlor. This is original heart pine under your feet. Refinished, never replaced. You can still see the faint ripple where the boards settled over the years." Heads tilted downward, murmurs of appreciation passed between guests. Someone bent to run their fingers along the floor, as if touching history might make it theirs for a moment. She moved them toward the mantel, its carved edges worn soft with age. "This piece is mahogany, shipped in from Charleston in 1892. The builder was proud enough to put it in his own ledger." She tapped the corner gently, the way one might pat an old friend's shoulder. Ivy drifted behind with her phone, snapping angled shots for the Neighborhood Association newsletter. She caught the stained glass transom over the front door, the polished brass of the doorknob, the way sunlight fell over Maggie's bookshelves like a benediction. "Through here is the dining room," Maggie continued, leading them toward the back. "The wainscoting is original. The craftsman used a tongue-and-groove method that was common in the region before the turn of the century. Still tight, not a single board loose." A woman in a wide-brimmed hat asked, "Do you give tours of the upstairs as well?" Maggie's smile didn't falter. "Oh no, the upstairs is a separate unit. Out of respect for privacy, we'll keep our focus here." There was a ripple of nods, agreement, understanding, but also the faint hum of curiosity denied. From above, a faint creak betrayed weight on the upstairs balcony. Maggie didn't look up right away, letting her guests move toward the tall bay window that framed the courtyard. Only when they were admiring the magnolia did she glance up. Chloe stood at the railing, both hands on the iron scrollwork, her face in shadow, but her posture stiff enough to read from the ground. "Lovely turnout," Ivy called up brightly, without breaking stride in her photography. Chloe didn't answer, only shifted her weight and disappeared inside. Maggie guided her group into the kitchen, the space warm with the scent of lemon polish and fresh biscuits she'd baked that morning. "The cabinetry is a faithful reproduction, but the hardware is original to the home," she explained, letting one of the architects turn a drawer pull in their hand. From the corner of her eye, she caught a flash of movement through the pass-through window, the upstairs kitchen, visible for a second through the shared courtyard view. Daniel was there, leaning on the counter, pretending to be absorbed in his phone. He didn't look toward the tour, but the way he lingered said he was listening. "Please, help yourselves to biscuits before we finish in the garden," Maggie offered, motioning toward the platter Ivy had strategically placed. While the group busied themselves, Ivy crouched to photograph the inlaid tile by the back door. Maggie led them out into the courtyard, pointing out the brick patterns that hinted at the original builder's hand, the wrought iron gate she'd had restored last spring. The air was just warm enough to carry the scent of ivy climbing the wall. One of the architects asked again, gently, "And the upstairs? Same detailing?" "Some, yes," Maggie said, her voice smooth as still water. "But I can't speak to any changes made there." Behind her, the upstairs curtain shifted. She didn't need to turn to know Chloe was watching again. Ivy straightened from her latest photo, catching Maggie's eye. "You've still got them eating out of your hand," she murmured, just for her. Maggie let herself smile, not for Chloe, not for Daniel, but for the knowledge that her space, her history, and her story were the ones on display. And the part that would stay with them most was what she'd left unseen. The Monday after the tour, the morning air smelled faintly of salt from the river, and Maggie was on her porch, robe wrapped loosely at the waist, coffee in hand. She'd been up early, the kind of early that comes when an idea won't stop whispering at you in the dark. The knock had come just after sunrise, a single, businesslike rap. Rob Finch stood there, pressed shirt, leather portfolio tucked under one arm, and the faint smile of a man who knew exactly what he was delivering. "Thought you might want to get this moving," he said, handing her a sheaf of neatly typed pages. She scanned the first paragraph, notice of intent to sell, 40% ownership share, and felt a quiet satisfaction settle in her bones. The offer was direct. Daniel and Chloe could buy her out for a fair market price, she named, or she could sell to a third party. "Deadline?" she asked. 30 days, Rob said. "Keeps it clean and legal." Ivy arrived 10 minutes later, sliding into the porch chair opposite Maggie with a bakery bag and 2 fresh croissants. She tore one in half, steam rising between them. "So," Ivy said, nodding toward the papers, "they either pay what you're asking or they get a stranger for a neighbor. Could be anyone. A family with kids, a jazz drummer, a couple who keeps goats." Maggie smiled into her coffee. "I'm partial to goats." They ate in companionable quiet while the city began to stir. Delivery trucks on the street, a pair of joggers passing by, the sound of church bells drifting in from Troop Square. Maggie finished her coffee, slid the papers back into their envelope, and set them neatly beside her chair. By Wednesday, the certified mail receipt came back signed. Chloe had been the one to open the door to the postal worker. Maggie had watched through the front window as the pen scratched across the green card. Chloe had taken the thick envelope without flipping it over, but when she did, her posture changed, a stiffening that ran from shoulders to jaw. From behind the glass, Maggie caught the moment Chloe tore it open. The paper trembled in her hands just enough to betray her. She didn't look toward the downstairs porch, but her walk back through the gate was faster than usual. That evening, as the streetlights flickered on, Maggie was at her kitchen table, sorting through the week's mail, when a knock came at her door. 3 measured knocks, not the hurried tapping Chloe favored. When she opened it, Daniel stood there alone, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He wore the same expression he used to bring home from grade school when the teacher had called about an incident. "Mom," he began, his tone careful, "we got your letter." Maggie stepped back just far enough to let him in. "I assumed you would." He hesitated, then crossed the threshold, glancing around as if the walls themselves might be eavesdropping. This is a big move. We didn't see it coming." "That's because you weren't looking," Maggie said, her voice mild but firm. He rubbed the back of his neck, eyes fixed on the floor. "It's not a good time for us to make that kind of purchase." 30 days, Daniel," Maggie said. "After that, I'll take it to market." He looked up then, as if hoping for some trace of softness in her face. She offered him the same polite, closed-lip smile she'd worn at the housewarming, an expression that said, "I see you, and I'm unmoved." From upstairs, faint but unmistakable, came the muffled sound of Chloe's voice calling his name. Sharp, urgent. Daniel swallowed. "We'll talk." "Do," Maggie said. He stepped back toward the door, pausing for a second as if there was more to say. But whatever it was, he kept it. The door closed quietly behind him. Maggie returned to her table, set the envelope in the center, and smoothed her hand over it once. Above her, footsteps crossed the upstairs floor fast, back and forth, the pattern of people pacing. And Maggie knew the clock had just started ticking loud enough for them to hear it. The man arrived on a Thursday afternoon, tall and thin in a linen jacket the color of unbleached paper. He introduced himself simply, Victor, and shook Maggie's hand with the ease of someone accustomed to gallery openings and private bids. They stood in the courtyard for a moment, the light sifting down through magnolia leaves, and he glanced toward her bay windows. "The downstairs gets all the good light," he said, half to himself. "Warm, steady. None of that harsh overhead glare?" Maggie smiled. "South-facing? It's why I've never put up heavy drapes." Victor nodded, as though filing away her choices as part of the property's value. "I like the vibe," he said finally, letting the word sit between them without apology. Ivy emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 glasses of iced tea, handing one to Victor like she'd known him for years. "You're in luck," she said. "She's showing the crown jewels today." Maggie led him inside, letting the rhythm of the rooms speak for themselves, the polished wood, the quiet weight of books, the faint citrus of lemon oil. He trailed his fingers along the wainscoting, paused to study the stained glass, nodded approvingly at the kitchen's brass pulls. They were in the dining room when footsteps crossed the upstairs floor. Moments later, Chloe appeared on the landing, smiling like she'd been waiting for her entrance. "Hello there," she said, leaning lightly on the banister. "I'm Chloe. My husband and I live upstairs. Would you like to see the other unit? It's more updated, open concept, great for entertaining." Victor returned the smile, polite but unmoved. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm here to see the space that's for sale." Something in Chloe's expression flickered before she recovered. "Well, if you change your mind—" "I won't," Victor said pleasantly, already turning back toward Maggie. By the time they returned to the courtyard, Daniel was standing near the gate, hands shoved into his pockets. He didn't acknowledge Victor at first, only looked at Maggie. "We need more time," he said, "to get financing in place." 2 weeks, Maggie said, her tone as even as if she were discussing the weather. "That's—" Daniel started. 2 weeks, she repeated. "After that, I'll proceed with the offer on the table." Victor gave a small, knowing nod, as though time limits were simply part of the game. "I'll have my attorney in touch," he said, extending his hand to Maggie once more. "A pleasure." When he'd gone, Daniel stood in the same spot, staring at the bricks under his shoes like they might offer a better answer than his mother was willing to. "We just need more time." He tried again. Maggie didn't waver. 2 weeks, Daniel. It's generous." From the porch, Ivy flipped open her leather-bound planner, the one she used only for matters of consequence, and uncapped her pen with deliberate ceremony. "Let's see," she murmured, scanning the weeks ahead. "Ah, yes. We'll mark it down. A holiday of sorts." Daniel glanced up sharply. "It's not a game." Ivy's eyes twinkled over the top of her glasses. "No," she agreed. "It's business." Maggie watched her son's mouth open, close, and open again before he turned toward the stairs. Chloe was waiting just inside the door, her arms crossed tight. When the door closed behind them, Ivy circled the date in her calendar twice, then slid the pen back into its loop. "Festivities," she said, with the satisfaction of someone who already knew how this chapter ended. Maggie let herself look toward the upstairs windows, curtains drawn, but the faintest shadow shifting behind them, and thought, 2 weeks will pass quickly for me. Not for them. The offer came in on a Wednesday morning, sealed in a cream envelope slid through Maggie's mail slot with a whisper. No fanfare, just a weight in her hands that told her before she even opened it. Victor's letter was short, almost spare, full cash offer for her 40%, closing date as soon as her attorney could process the paperwork. No contingencies, no delays. She read it twice at her kitchen table, the sunlight catching the edge of her coffee cup. The number was more than she'd asked. By noon, Rob was in her front room, portfolio open, documents laid out with military precision. "We can move fast on this," he said, sliding a pen across the table. "He's wired the deposit already." "I'd like that," Maggie said. By the end of the day, signatures had been inked, copies notarized, and the closing date fixed like a stone in the calendar. The only thing left was to start packing. That night, Maggie pulled the stepladder from the hall closet and began with her rare books, the leather-bound histories and limited editions that had lived on her top shelves for decades. She cradled each one in paper, sliding them into sturdy boxes marked in her precise hand: library, storage. Halfway through the second box there was a knock, too soft to be the postal carrier, too hesitant to be Ivy. She opened the door to find Chloe, her eyes rimmed pink, a tissue crushed in one hand. "Maggie, please," Chloe began, voice trembling. "I know we've had our differences, but selling to a stranger, it's not good for anyone. We can make this work. We'll make space for you. We'll—" She stopped, as if the words caught in her throat. "We're family." Maggie rested a hand on the edge of the door. "Family doesn't strip the bones from a house without asking." "I'm sorry," Chloe whispered, and for a moment the tear clinging to her lashes looked unpracticed. Real. I thought we could fix this." "Some things aren't broken," Maggie said gently. Chloe's mouth pressed into a line. She nodded once and turned back toward the stairs. Minutes later, Daniel appeared in the doorway, his hands deep in his pockets, his jaw working but no words coming. He looked at the boxes, at the ladder, then back at her. She waited. Nothing. Finally, he gave a small shake of his head, stepped back, and left without closing the door. It was Ivy who closed it, stepping inside with a small canvas tote slung over her shoulder. "Got the new keys," she said, holding them up like a prize. "Thought we'd do this while the ink's still wet." Together, they went down to the shared entry and into the small mechanical room that housed the main locks. Ivy worked with brisk efficiency, unscrewing the old brass cylinders, slotting in the replacements with a satisfying click. Maggie stood just inside the doorway, watching as her friend turned the new key in place. The sound was sharp, final. "There," Ivy said, pocketing the old lock set. "Fresh start." From upstairs came the faint creak of floorboards, Daniel or Chloe moving toward the stairs. Maggie stayed where she was, meeting the sound halfway with stillness. The door at the top of the stairs opened and Daniel's voice carried down. "What are you doing?" "Securing what's mine," Maggie said. The pause that followed was heavy enough to feel in her bones. Then the door shut again, slow and deliberate. Ivy dropped the keys into Maggie's palm. "Your turn to hold them," she said. Maggie closed her fingers around the cool metal, the weight solid and certain. And upstairs, the footsteps began again, restless, circling, like someone searching for a way out that wasn't there anymore. The invitation arrived on a folded note card, slid under Maggie's door in Daniel's handwriting. "Dinner. Just us. Before the closing. 7 p.m. Thursday. No explanation, no flourish." She arrived at their door on time, dressed in a soft navy blouse and trousers, hair brushed back in a way that looked effortless but wasn't. Chloe opened it with a smile too smooth to be casual. "Maggie, come in. Wine?" she asked, holding up a glass already half filled with deep red. "I will, thank you," Maggie said, stepping inside. The upstairs smelled of rosemary and garlic, something slow roasting in the oven. The table was set with their wedding china, white linen napkins folded in a way that suggested Chloe had watched a tutorial. Daniel emerged from the kitchen carrying a platter. "Roast beef," he said, setting it down at the center of the table. "Figured we'd keep it classic." "It smells wonderful," Maggie said, and meant it. She slid into the chair opposite him as Chloe poured her wine, the bottle held at a careful angle. They ate in relative quiet for the first few minutes, the only sounds the clink of silverware and the occasional murmur about the seasoning. Maggie complimented the roast, tender, perfectly cooked, and Chloe's shoulders eased a fraction, as if she'd scored a point she hadn't expected to win. Halfway through, Daniel cleared his throat. "We just wanted to end this on the right note, whatever happens next." Chloe nodded quickly. "New beginnings," she added, lifting her glass. Maggie picked up her own, meeting both their eyes in turn. "To respecting your landlord," she said, voice even, the faintest curve at the corner of her mouth. For a beat, the room was still. Then Ivy, who had been invited as a neutral presence and was seated at the end of the table, let out a small, stifled sound that was part cough, part laugh. She pressed her napkin to her lips, eyes bright. Daniel's glass froze mid-air before he took a sip, gaze dropping to his plate. Chloe smiled tightly, as if determined to keep the mood from slipping, and asked about Maggie's plans after the sale. Maggie answered pleasantly, speaking of bookshops and walks by the park, her tone free of malice but not without meaning. The rest of the meal moved forward on the rails of forced civility. Dessert appeared, Chloe's lemon tart, garnished with a sprig of mint, and everyone pretended it was just another dinner. But the undercurrent hummed like a wire pulled taut, each polite exchange another twist. When Maggie rose to leave, Chloe followed her to the door, wineglass still in hand. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, as though trying out sincerity for size. Maggie met her gaze, polite as ever. "Of course." As the door closed behind her, she could still hear Ivy's muffled chuckle from inside, and she thought, not without satisfaction, one more meal, and I'll never have to sit at that table again. The morning of the closing broke clear and cool, the kind of Savannah day that seemed to polish every brick and magnolia leaf. Maggie stood in front of her mirror, fastening the clasp on a strand of pearls she hadn't worn in years. Not for sentiment, just for the way they caught the light. Rob's office smelled faintly of ink and oiled wood. He had the paperwork already spread across the conference table, each page neatly tabbed. Victor was there too, linen jacket immaculate, signing his name with a fountain pen that glided like a skater over ice. "Everything in order," Rob said, sliding the final document toward Maggie. His tone held the brisk cheer of a man who liked a clean deal. Maggie read each line, not because she doubted him, but because she enjoyed the act of taking her time. When she signed, the pen made a deliberate, steady line. By 11:43 a.m., Rob confirmed the wire transfer had cleared. "Funds are in your account," he said, handing her a printout. She slipped it into her leather folio, the weight of it less than the satisfaction it carried. "Thank you, Rob." Outside, the sun warmed the back of her neck as she crossed the sidewalk. Somewhere behind her, Victor and Rob were discussing access codes and utility transfers. Somewhere else, no doubt, Daniel and Chloe were realizing that their new co-owner was a man they'd never met beyond a handshake and who owed them nothing. 2 hours later, Maggie was standing in the doorway of her new condo, overlooking Forsyth Park. The afternoon light spilled in across pale oak floors, touching the edge of the white wainscoting like it had been waiting for her. Boxes were stacked in tidy rows, labeled in her careful hand. Ivy emerged from the kitchen with 2 mugs of tea, humming a melody Maggie didn't recognize. "Bedroom's almost done," she reported, "and your desk fits perfectly by the window, just like I said it would." Maggie set her bag down on the entry table and took the mug. "You were right." They worked in companionable silence, unwrapping china, stacking books, tucking folded sweaters into drawers that smelled faintly of cedar. Every so often, Ivy's hum would drift into a line of song, quiet but certain. Around 4 o'clock, there was a knock on the door. Tasha stood there, grinning, a foil-covered dish in her hands. "Housewarming," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an answer. "Peach cobbler. Still warm." The scent filled the kitchen instantly, sweet, buttery, the peaches giving off that syrupy perfume that could bend the will of the most disciplined eater. They ate it standing at the counter, 3 spoons dipping into the dish. The park beyond the window was alive with late-afternoon strollers, the air outside golden and soft. "You're going to love it here," Tasha said. "Close to the farmer's market, quiet enough to think, but not so quiet you forget where you are." Maggie smiled, not at the cobbler, not even at the new view, but at the thought of her old courtyard, of upstairs windows drawn shut, of footsteps pacing with no audience to hear them but their own. Ivy caught her expression and smirked. "To fresh starts," she said, raising her spoon. They clinked spoons like glasses. From somewhere deep in Maggie's bag, her phone buzzed, a text from an unfamiliar number. Just 2 words, "We need to talk." She didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she set her empty dish in the sink, rinsed the spoon, and turned back to the last of her boxes. There was still light in the day and plenty of time to decide how, or if, she'd answer. The first party in Maggie's new condo began just as the park outside shifted from gold to indigo. From her balcony, she could see the lanterns in the Forsyth gazebo flicker to life, the curved ironwork catching the light like something out of an old postcard. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of baked brie and rosemary crackers, the clink of glasses and the murmur of voices rising and falling like a tide. Friends and neighbors had drifted in through the open door. Mrs. Greer from the Historical Society, Tasha with another cobbler in tow, 2 of the architects who had once toured her old parlor. Ivy was stationed near the sideboard, topping off drinks with the practiced ease of someone who knew everyone's preferred pour. "Sweet tea for you, Arnold Palmer for you," she said, moving between guests in her soft-soled shoes, leaving behind a trail of polite laughter. The balcony was strung with warm white lights, their glow brushing the curve of the wrought iron railing and spilling out onto the park below. From here, Maggie could see the fountain at the center, its spray catching the last of the daylight before melting into the glow of the lamp posts. She stood at the doorway for a moment, letting the scene settle into her. Friends in easy conversation, the gentle hum of music drifting from the park gazebo, the way the breeze lifted the edge of the linen runner on her dining table. It was the kind of view you didn't have to own to feel rich, but she did own it, and that made it sweeter. Ivy appeared at her side with a flat, wrapped package under one arm. "Housewarming gift," she said, pressing it into Maggie's hands. "And before you ask, no, it's not a goat." Maggie peeled away the paper to reveal a thick, leather-bound scrapbook. On the first page, in Ivy's careful handwriting, were the words, "Tenant to Triumph." Below it, a photograph of Maggie on the day she'd signed the papers for her share of the old building, the courtyard lights strung behind her. The pages turned like a quiet history, the mismatched chairs for her first courtyard party, the dessert table loaded with cobbler, Ivy's candid shots of guests mid-laughter. There were clipped articles from the neighborhood newsletter, one with the headline, "Historic Home Hosts Reunion." Even the notice of sale Rob had drafted was tucked in a sleeve, printed on its crisp letterhead. Maggie's fingers traced the edges of each page. She felt no ache, no bitterness, only the kind of satisfaction that came from a plan well played and a life redirected by her own hand. "Thought you might want the receipts," Ivy said, a sly smile in her voice. "They're lovely," Maggie said, and meant it. From the balcony, Tasha called over her shoulder, "They've got a jazz trio tonight. Listen." The music floated in, low brass, a brush on a snare, a saxophone curling around a melody that didn't need words. Guests drifted toward the railing, leaning out to catch more of it, their conversation falling into the rhythm. Maggie refilled her glass with sweet tea, the ice clinking against the sides. She poured another for Mrs. Greer, who was deep in discussion with one of the architects about cornice restoration. The talk of buildings and preservation swirled around her like an old, familiar language. As the evening eased on, the park lights grew sharper against the dark, and the smell of night-blooming jasmine threaded in from below. Maggie found herself at the edge of the balcony, looking out past the fountain to the far line of trees, their leaves rustling in a breeze that barely touched her cheek. She felt Ivy step up beside her. "This," Ivy said quietly, "feels permanent." Maggie glanced down at her glass, then back at the park. "It feels chosen," she said. Somewhere in her bag inside, her phone began to buzz again. She didn't move to answer it. Not yet. The phone kept buzzing. 3 times. Then silence. Then another single vibration that felt more insistent. Maggie stepped back inside, the warm light and low conversation folding around her like a shawl. She found her bag on the armchair, slipped the phone from its pocket, and saw Daniel's name glowing on the screen. One message. "We need to talk." Her thumb hovered over the keyboard for a moment, the murmur of her guests a soft undertone in the room. She could picture him upstairs in his kitchen, pacing, glancing toward Chloe and back again. Waiting. She typed slowly, deliberately, "My door is always open." For respect. No exclamation points, no soft edges. She hit send, set the phone face down on the side table, and left it there. The smell of cobbler drew her back toward the kitchen, where Tasha was laughing with one of the architects, her fork poised over the last square inch of the dish. Only the browned edges clung to the sides now, the syrupy center long gone. "Guess we'll need another one next week," Tasha said, tapping her fork against the plate. "Or tomorrow," Ivy said from her post at the drinks table. She had her glass lifted halfway already, waiting for a lull in conversation. When the moment came, she caught Maggie's eye and spoke clear enough to cut through the murmur. "To the woman who owned the room," she said. It wasn't loud, but it carried. Heads turned. A ripple of laughter moved through the group, warm, genuine, the kind that comes when everyone in earshot knows exactly what's meant and who it's meant for. Maggie felt her cheeks lift into a smile. Not the polite one she reserved for certain upstairs neighbors, but the real one, the one that had been absent for too many years. She raised her glass in return, letting the clink of ice be her answer. The night seemed to soften around them. On the balcony, someone leaned on the railing to listen to the jazz drifting up from the park gazebo, a tune slow enough to make the air feel thick with summer. Across the street, the lamplight gilded the leaves, and beyond that, the fountain's steady rhythm sounded almost like applause. Maggie moved between her guests, touching a shoulder here, refilling a glass there, her steps unhurried. The hum of the city beyond her windows seemed to join the party. Distant voices on the path, a bicycle bell, the low thrum of tires over cobblestone. Savannah had a way of making every evening feel like it might last forever if you wanted it to. In the kitchen, Ivy was telling the story of the first courtyard party again, the one with the brisket smoke curling over the fence and the neighbors who wandered in uninvited. Only this time, she ended it differently. "And she didn't just host it," Ivy said, nodding toward Maggie. "She claimed it." Maggie leaned in the doorway listening. It wasn't about the food or the lights strung in the trees, it was about presence, about deciding who you were in a space and making sure everyone else knew it too. When the plates were scraped clean and the cobbler dish sat empty on the counter, the guests began to drift toward the door. The air outside was still warm, the scent of jasmine lingering, the city's heartbeat steady beneath it all. Maggie stood at the threshold, thanking each person as they stepped into the night. Ivy lingered last, slipping her empty glass onto the counter and giving Maggie a look that was equal parts pride and mischief. "You hear that?" she asked, tilting her head toward the open balcony. Maggie listened. The music from the gazebo, the faint laughter from a couple on the park bench, the steady, quiet pulse of the place she'd chosen. "Yes," Maggie said, "I hear it." For a long moment they stood together, watching the lights in the park. Somewhere behind her the phone buzzed again, faint against the wood of the side table. She didn't turn. "In Savannah," she said, more to herself than to Ivy. "Hospitality is a gift." She took a slow sip of her tea, the ice tapping against the glass. "So is knowing when to take it back."